Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's March 10, 2025, and today we're speaking with an old friend of the show, Dr. Michael Dunford, who is about to join the Department of Southeast Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. We're going to talk about his recently completed PhD thesis in anthropology at the ANU called The Flavour of Empire, Tea Production and the Ta'an World in Highland, Southeast Asia. G'day, Mike.
Good morning. How are you doing, Luke?
Very well here. It's slowly heating up. We're getting one of those hot days in March in Australia. Now, you and I both studied the same program at ANU, but you made a much better fist of it, I must say. And you've been on Myanmar Musings in several different capacities before. But today, I just want to focus on your thesis. Maybe do something like a valedictory interview, exit interview. 5 years ago on this show, you introduced your research interests and the challenges that the COVID-19 lockdowns were presenting to your fieldwork. And since then, well, there's also been a coup in Myanmar. But now you're finished, so here's the big question. And in some ways, it's a standard PhD question. What thesis did you think you were going to write when you started out? And what thesis have you actually ended up writing?
Yeah, gosh, thanks. That's a great question. It's funny how how much has changed in the world since then. The thesis that I set out to write when I started the PhD, I thought was going to be all about tea. And I guess it still is about tea, but so much has happened in real time since 2019, like immediate events like the pandemic and the military coup. Like, so much has happened in real time that the longer historical processes that I was hoping to look at kind of ended up taking second place to understanding what's happening right now. Although in the end, I tried to pay attention to both things. But so in short, in December 2019, when I started fieldwork, my focus for the thesis was all about Namsan and the relationship between Namsan and Chautme and the relationship between Mandalay with both of them, Namsan and Chautme being in northern Shan state and Mandalay in the central dry zone. So just for Myanmar Musings listeners who aren't familiar, Namsan is a town which is the undisputed center of Myanmar's tea industry. It's been that way for centuries. This is an old thing. Namsan is also majority Ta'ang. So the Ta'ang are also known as the Palaung, but Palaung is considered, they consider that term to be impolite, so I'll use Ta'ang. The Ta'an kind of live across the highlands of mainland Southeast Asia, from Yunnan in the north, across all of Myanmar's Shan state, and down into northern Thailand. But for all of them, wherever they are, tea is a major part of their culture. And Namsan is maybe the epicenter of Ta'an culture. It's certainly one of the densest population sites in the Ta'an world. And it's a major production center of tea. So back in 2019, I was really focused on getting into Namsan, understanding Namsan. Namsan's kind of a production site. Chautme is between Namsan and Mandalay. Chautme is kind of a trade site, a brokerage site. And then Mandalay is a big tea distribution site where there's brokerage, production, trade, and it's where tea kind of goes out to the rest of Myanmar. So I was living in Mandalay, making frequent visits to northern Shan state, and I thought that this was going to be the thesis, me on the ground in northern Myanmar following the thing around. But of course, that's not what happened. I guess the thesis that I ended up writing, forced in part by the COVID-19 pandemic and the military coup, had to take a much bigger perspective. So rather than following tea and tea traders and tea producers on the ground between Namsan and central Myanmar, I tried to think about, from afar, what can I understand about the tea industry in Myanmar as a whole? what can I understand about the Ta'ang world as a whole, and to what extent do those systems overlap? Like, how much truth really is there between the stereotype about the spread of Ta'ang people and the spread of the tea plant? I don't know if I got all the way to answering that particular question, but so that's what the thesis ended up being, is this more kind of system-wide perspective on tea in Southeast Asia and the Ta'ang people and the intersections between those two things. I hope that's not too vague.
No, no, no. That's great. Thanks. And maybe we go a little bit more into detail about who the Da'an are. You mentioned that they've got at least two different names and where they sort of live, and they're involved in tea cultivation. What language do they speak? I mean, what kinds of places do they inhabit? Yeah, could you just give us a little bit more about this interesting and less known community in Southeast Asia?
Defining who the Ta'ang are is kind of a tricky project. I think of them as a constellation, like stars in the sky, a constellation of a bunch of different, related but different cultural and language groups who speak related languages and who have a word like ta'ang, but there are different variants of it. It might be ta'ang, it might be daraang, riang, aang, deang. These all refer to the collective of all ta'ang people, but individual groups within this constellation will also have a separate way of referring to themselves. So ta'ang kind of is an umbrella term that refers to the whole collection of groups, but then individual groups may have a different way of referring to themselves, such as like Samlon, for example. So Samlon is one ethnic group within the Ta'ang constellation. They definitely consider themselves Ta'ang, but they also consider themselves Samlon, which is distinct from a different group, say Ruching. So Ruching Ta'ang and Samlon Ta'ang, they have different languages that are intelligible to some degree. Some words might be similar, but some words are not. Then they will have similar patterns of, for example, traditional clothing. So women will have elaborate formal wear. Men will wear kind of simple, dark clothing in formal situations, but the specific way that clothing looks is totally different, to the point of not being recognizably the same thing. But the bigger pattern is the same, which is why this kind of umbrella category of Ta'ang makes sense. But one thing that will definitely tie them together is the importance of tea to their culture. So in just sticking with the two groups who I mentioned. So the Samlon people famously, I don't think it's a huge stretch to say that most people who identify as Samlon would make most of their income from the tea industry. The Samlon are the majority of Namsan, and they play a dominant role in the tea industry. But the Rujing, for example, there are a lot of Rujing people who cultivate tea, for sure, but it's also a much larger subgroup within Ta'ang, and there would be a lot of them who don't, go by the traditional tea cultivation system for livelihoods. There, I know a lot of Rujing farmers who grow other things, Rujing truck drivers. So this kind of, tea is still important to them, but it doesn't define their entire economic world the way it does more so for Samlon people. Those are just two examples. There's if you read Burmese, there's a book called Da'an Tamain, Da'ang History, which is written by a teacher named Mai Aik Go. You can still buy it in Yangon, I think, at places like the Pansadan Street bookstalls and those kinds of places. You can find it, and that goes into a lot of detail about the different subgroups. There's another, now quite dated but still useful book if you want to know more. Leslie Milne's The Home of an Eastern Clan, which is a colonial ethnography from the 20s. But if you're interested in kind of the boundaries of Taang people, those are and kind of who's included and who's not. Those are two books to check out.
Hmm. Okay, thank you. Now we've got a handle of the Daang, and you've mentioned that your thesis is about much more than tea, but a lot of your thesis is still about tea, and you've named your work Flavors of Empire. In the introduction to the thesis, you assign three different kinds of tea in Myanmar to three different kinds of empire. Now, while I brew myself a cup of Burmese tea here, could you explain these flavors and these empires?
Yeah, for sure. So in any given, kind of if you go to, let's say, a tea shop or kind of an everyday restaurant in Myanmar, um, you are likely to find two and maybe three types of tea. So just to summarize them really quickly, there's lepet or pickled tea. Then there's yenwe jam, which usually in English we gloss it as green tea. So that's like tea where whole leaves are steeped in water, and then you drink the steeped liquid, which will be like a greenish to reddish to brownish color, but transparent. Then finally, there's milk tea, lepeye, which is like slightly more of a specialist product in Myanmar. Like pickled tea, you can get almost anywhere. Green tea, you can get almost anywhere. Milk tea, like lepeye, you've got to go to a tea shop or to a place that kind of sells it because it's slightly more complicated to make. But so yeah, I feel that each of these products kind of carries within it a history of imperial expansion, or at least to imperial influence. So starting with pickled tea, lepet, um, this to me is inseparable from the different empires who have been centered around what is now Myanmar's dry zone. So that's the Bagan Empire, Daungu Empire, Ava, Bago, and so on, all the way down to the Gombaun dynasty. Those are the imperial states. But Lepet is also inseparable from the hills that surround Myanmar's dry zone on all sides, and especially what is now Shan state. So the places where Lepet is made, the places where it is consumed, those are places where the historical empires of what is now Myanmar's dry zone have influence. So kind of the flavor of lepet, when you're eating lepet, you are eating a product that is deeply linked to the expansion of those local Burmese empires. So then there's green tea, yenwe jam. It's kind of funny to call it green tea in English because I don't know if tea industry professionals would agree with that, but it's clear tea brewed from whole leaves with no milk or other adulterations added, theoretically. And to me, Yenwejan green tea, this is all about Chinese influence in sort of the greater Han imperial world, which of course spills into Myanmar and covers a lot of Southeast Asia. I don't think this is necessarily like front of mind for the average Yenwejiang consumer in Myanmar. Like usually, you sit down at a restaurant, they give you a carafe of Yenwejiang as though it's like in a restaurant in Australia, for example, you would get like a carafe of tap water. It's just a drink, and I don't think they would think like, oh, this is something Chinese that I'm drinking for the everyday Yenwejiang consumer, that is. But you start to see the Chinese influence more when you start moving into higher grades of green tea, oolong tea, whole leaf black tea. When you start getting fancy Yenwejiang, for example, talking to a tea seller in the market, that's where the Chinese influence starts to be a little bit more obvious, where they would say like Kokang varieties of tea grown in Myanmar are like a higher grade than the ones grown in Shan state. So the ones that come from closer to China are more prestigious variants of Yenwejian than like more domestic ones. You'll also get tea sellers when they offer you like a taste of their finer Yenwejian, they'll serve it to you in kind of a Chinese style. Um, so to me, this consumption of Yenwejian has a lot to do with kind of Chinese cultural imperial expansion, not just in the 20th century, but over thousands of years. And then finally, there's milk tea. So that's the product that, is kind of the famous Myanmar lepeye, Myanmar milk tea, as famous as lepet itself, like pickled tea. Um, Milk tea to me is very much a creation of the post colony. It takes this industrial product developed by British imperial colonial capitalists, the industrial product being like processed black tea, like the kind of stuff that you find in a tea bag, and then it puts a local spin on it. So there are a couple of authors other than me where I think you can go to read more about this, milk tea as a colonial and especially a post-colonial creation, like colonial invention that exploded in the post-colonial period. And one of those is a really cool undergraduate paper written by a scholar called Nayantara Arora. And then another is I think, fairly well known now, Sarah Besky's book, Tasting Qualities. So Aurora's work, she has a paper called Chai as a Colonial Creation. Besky's book, Tasting Qualities, this is where, neither of them are writing about Myanmar. They're writing about India. But I think when you try to trace the origin of lepeye in Myanmar, you can also read more about this in Dinith Adhikari's thesis, 'cause he really drilled down into the lepeye industry. You find that lepeye is this thing that emerges in the 50s and 60s, really, in Myanmar, which is wild to me because it feels like it's this thing that's been there forever. And tea shops are so integral to Myanmar culture. Lepeye is so iconic of Burmese street food, but it's really this thing that's only been around for, a couple of generations versus something like lepet, pickled tea, which is sort of prehistoric in Myanmar, inseparable from the earliest days of Burmese written history.
Thank you, Mike. Oh, look, that's really fascinating. It's great to have that sort of rubric. It's going to make a lot of people want to travel to Myanmar, that's for sure. But, in your thesis, you also go into not just these sorts of empirical details, but myths and stories about tea and the Ta'ang people. One example, you say that the Ta'ang people evocatively refer to tea leaves as being their blood. Now, but you did do a PhD in anthropology, so you don't just, put a bunch of myths. You say that these narratives of the Ta'ang's relationship with tea actually form a body of political theory. What do you mean by that? Please tell us all about it.
Yeah, so broadly, I think that when people tell stories in the mythological mode, when people tell myths, I think they're not just telling stories. I think they're expressing ideas about something. And when Ta'ang people say tea is our blood, and when you hear mythological stories that connect the origin of the tea plant to the origin of Ta'ang people, like these stories are absolutely used to explain political claims. But to figure out what type of political claim it is when you say tea is our blood, it's worth thinking a little bit about what the tea plant is, where it comes from, and what relation that has or doesn't have to Ta'ang people. So when they say tea is our blood, what they are saying is that they have a kind of absolute attachment to the places where tea is grown and where it has been cultivated for millennia. So this idea that tea is the blood of the Ta'ang people is a kind of political idea about place and territory. Nobody can really point to the precise origin of the tea plant. As far as written memory goes, it has kind of always existed in many of the places where it currently is, in far northern Myanmar, in northeast India, in southwest China. By analogy, you could say the same thing of the Ta'ang people. If they are inseparable from the tea plant, if it's this thing that's kind of physically part of them, the claim that they're making is that they are inseparable from the places where tea has always been, according to the best historical record we have access to. So then, I think there's also a kind of different mythological project happening with tea, and this one I have to get into a little bit of mythological detail if that's all right with you.
Oh, it's great. Let's do it.
Okay, so there's a story that you'll hear in Myanmar when you start talking about tea, and it's kind of a founding myth of the Burmese imperial project, but it's also kind of a founding myth for Ta'ang people, even though in many cases they don't really like it. They know the story, they tell it, and then they say, this is kind of nonsense. But they still tell it because it's so pervasive. And the myth is basically this. A long time ago, King Alansithu, this kind of father figure of the Burmese state and this founding figure of the Bagan Empire, received magic seeds from a kind of divine entity, one of the guardians of Mount Meru, the Buddhist cosmological model of the universe. King Alansithu received these kind of magical tea seeds from a deity. Magical seeds. Tea is not in the story quite yet. So Alansithu is famous for these travels. He goes all around what is now Southeast Asia. He goes all the way north towards what is now China, and at some point he passes by the Ta'ang kingdom at what is now Namsan. And one of Alansithu's goals as he's wandering around is to spread Buddhism. So he decides to build a stupa, build a pagoda at Namsan, and the king of Namsan and his people help him a lot. They get really dedicated to building this. They become very pious Buddhists. And as a gift, Alansithu gives the Ta'ang the first tea seed. And then from there, the tea industry of Namsan grows, which becomes the tea industry of what is now all of Myanmar. That's the myth. So people use this myth in different ways. In kind of Burma spaces, like ethnically Burmese spaces, for example, like I heard a tea company who was using this myth in their marketing literature to kind of say, like, see, tea is an early example of interethnic cooperation and Burmese benevolence to the frontier areas of the country. But then, when I repeated this explanation to some of my Ta'ang friends, they were like, oh, no, that is nonsense. That sounds like a UNDP, like agricultural development project. And that's not what happened. Tea is a Ta'ang thing. That stuff about Alansithu is nonsense. So in this way, this myth of Alansithu and the tea seed becomes something that both Burmese people and Ta'ang people use to express political ideas about one another in this context. That's like a bit of an oversimplification, but I hope you can see what I mean there about, how myths themselves can become a way that people express political ideas.
Well, something that strikes me related to that, maybe a bit of a diversion, is that, if you go back a few centuries, there were no Christians in the uplands of Myanmar. Now, when people do these sort of crude, typologies of different groups, they say, oh, the Kachin they're now a Christian group, and the Chin, oh, they're now a Christian group. The Ta'an has a Christian minority, as I understand it. So another way that one thing this myth makes me think about is that, it entrenches the prosperity and the blood of the Ta'an with Buddhism. So that's a good sort of project for proselytization as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. There's definitely a Christian minority within the Ta'ang, but I think the point you're making about Buddhism is also super important to this story, and I think it's something that like the story kind of pits a dry zone kingdom in relation to this like upland kingdom at Namsam. But the fact that it's about Buddhism spreading and kind of tea being the result of the like good Buddhist piety of the Taang people, I think kind of it makes a commonality between the two cultures that I think you're right is like not the same type of myth wouldn't make sense if it was told in relation to one of the groups who now in the 20th century is proudly Christian. I don't think it would work. The logic, kind of the political logic of the story works on this kind of Buddhist connection.
Yeah, and so that's a fantastic part of your thesis, and I mean I encourage everyone to read it. Of course, you can get it for free from the ANU website. But now I want to talk about another angle that you found very useful, which is the pueza, the broker. These people that exist across all segments of Myanmar society. I'm sure anyone who's been to Myanmar for an extended period of time has had dealings with some kind of broker, even if they didn't realize it. So I wanted to ask you about the business side of this. You started this interview talking about Mandalay, Jaltme, Namsan. How does the business of the tea work, the supply chain, commodity chain of tea work in Myanmar? And what did you learn about the Da'ang people and the region by studying it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess I'll start with kind of an overview, and then I'll work back towards the first part of your question about Bueza. So the tea industry in Myanmar, I should say, before we begin, that things have changed a lot since the coup and still are changing, and my information may be slightly out of date. Um, and inaccurate, and it's worth keeping up with the Burmese language news if you can, especially Shui Pi Nye. They are a newspaper that covers northern Shan state in specific detail, and they write a lot about the tea industry. But so in broad terms, this is how it works. There are sort of two tea industry hubs in Shan State, one in the north and one in the south. So the one in the north, the fields are mostly kind of around Namsan and kind of from the Chinese border down to Chaotmei, with Namsan in the middle being kind of the big hub of tea production. In general, the tea growing areas, the fields under cultivation, are much larger in the north than they are in the south. There's an ILO report about the tea industry in southern Myanmar, where about 1/3 of Myanmar's tea is grown, and the average holding size is 3 acres, so tiny pieces of land compared to tea farms in India average in the thousands of hectares. So Myanmar's tea industry is effectively this huge patchwork of smallholders who engage in face-to-face dealings with brokers, who then engage in further face-to-face dealings with kind of accumulators, aggregators who buy tea. Almost all of the deals are made face-to-face across the supply chain. It's not like, for example, agricultural commodity trading in, say, or even let's say the tea industry in India, where sort of brokers may never interact with farmers. They only deal with sort of a landowner. That's not the case in Myanmar. Everything is happening on a much smaller scale and accumulated through many more steps. So the northern tea industry The fields are kind of around Namsan. Some of the famous sites for tea production are Namsan itself, Guanhe, which is a village, Myote or New City, which is another village. Myote is near Namsan, near Guanhe. Aram is another famous one. So there are these famous villages around Namsan that are famous for their tea. Tea is then traded to bueza or brokers, who either travel out to the farms or who are based in towns like Chautme. Chautme is a major center for it. Sipo is another kind of secondary center for it. Chautme is a bit bigger than Sipo. And then Mandalay is a huge tea brokerage center. Then the southern route is based mostly around places like Bindia, Binlaon, and Kalaw, and is also traded to some extent in Mandalay and to some extent directly to Yangon. But the northern industry is bigger than the southern industry. So that's kind of the broad overview. The tea industry took a major hit after COVID-19. It sort of bottomed out as the baht was devalued in Myanmar and inflation went rampant. Tea producers were making less and less money, and some of the kind of iconic tea products that have been at a stable price for years suddenly increased significantly in price. But even still, according to producers I talked to, they kind of couldn't increase their prices fast enough to keep up with inflation and to keep up with the devaluation of the baht in order to turn a profit. This was kind of 2020, 2021. But it seems like maybe things were starting to change in 2023, in that there were a few kind of tea sales that were big enough, which is to say that like farmers got a good enough price on their tea that they kind of made the news. And there was this brief moment of optimism, at least within Namsan itself, if not in the rest of the tea industry. But as far as I know, the tea industry is still struggling to recover from the initial collapse that it experienced after the COVID-19 pandemic, although there have been like glimmers of optimism. So that's kind of the overview of the tea market where it is right now. So then onto the role of the bueza. So I struggled a lot with this concept of the bueza for basically two reasons. So within Myanmar, as you know, Luke, and as many of the listeners will know, this figure of the broker or the agent, the bueza, they're kind of an evil figure. They're kind of viewed as like vampires or parasites. This if someone is like considered to be kind of a wheeler dealer, they might get called a buesa, kind of jokingly, but it's kind of an insult in some ways. But at the same time, you know, something that doing this research really taught me is that as much as people hate buesas and as much as they do, you know, profit by taking a cut from vulnerable people like farmers, like Myanmar couldn't feed itself without buesa. They are the glue that holds the agricultural economy together. The system wouldn't function without them, and part of this is because of the terrain of Myanmar. Like in the specific case of the tea industry, the places where tea is grown are somewhat hard to access. The roads are treacherous and unpredictable, so you need to have sort of specialist driving skills. And you also need to really specialize in crossing social boundaries. So if you want to make money in the tea industry, you have to sell to Bama people. They're 60% of the country. But a lot of the places where tea is grown are places where ethnic tension is fairly high, especially right now. So Namsan, like if you want to do business in Namsan, you need to go with a Ta'ang person, or you need to be able to speak the language or have some kind of cultural intimacy with Ta'ang people in some way. And Buesa brokers, they can do this stuff. These guys are specialists in navigating treacherous terrain, in crossing social boundaries. Um, and in a way, I kind of relate to them. I mean, as an as a foreign academic in Myanmar, I'm also engaging in the extractive industry of listening to people's stories and then turning them into academic products. I'm doing Buesa work in a way. I'm also meant to cross social boundaries between the lowlands and the highlands, and between Anglo American Australian culture and Burmese and Shan and Ta'ang culture, as it were. So I totally understand the distrust of Buesa in the tea industry and in other industries, but I have some sympathy for them in a way.
Thank you so much, Mike. So, and you've kind of expressed that things might be a little bit different now, and one of the reasons for that is not just the pandemic and the coup and everything we've discussed, but also that the central or most important ethnic armed organization claiming to represent the Ta'ang people, that's the Ta'ang National Liberation Army, has actually launched a big offensive in northern Shan State. As since you really did your research proper, they now control a substantial portion of northern Shan State and some of Mandalay region, and they're engaged in active fighting along the road down to Mandalay. So what has this sort of military success for the Ta'ang people, you could say, meant for, I guess, the tea business, but for inter communal relations, or for the, if we take the Ta'ang as an ethnic homogenous group with, zero sum sort of power gains, re the Burma. What is this? What has this war done?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's complicated. I mean, so in one sense, I think there's a huge amount of pride for many Dang people in what the TNLA has been able to accomplish. There's no doubt about that. Um, but at the same time, any armed group, regardless of who they represent, is going to do things in war that hurt people. Like the thing that the organization does more than anything else is carry arms and execute military exercises, right? So I think there's been a lot of pride in things like, you know, the TNLA representing a kind of resistance against tyranny, and specifically against the Sittat, the Myanmar military. There's been a lot of pride in the educational gains that the TNLA have been able to make through the Ta'ang Education Organization. But at the same time, they engage in conscription. They demand resources from villages where they occupy, and when they plant landmines, those landmines can blow up people of any, the landmines target anyone who walks across them. So, Operation 1027 was a huge point of celebration, I think, for many Ta'ang people, but it's also something that made people made people nervous. So I think there were a lot of questions about kind of like, under the TNLA, are things going to be worse than they were or better than they were? I think it was hard for people to imagine how a new armed group it was hard for some people to imagine how a new armed group being in charge would necessarily make anything better. What I think, you know, what I think could be a good outcome of this is maybe being forced to answer some questions about how governance is going to work in concrete terms in a lot of areas where the Ta'ang live, where for many years there was fighting between the Restoration Council of Shan State, the RCSS, the TNLA, and the Sita, the junta forces. There was kind of trilateral fighting, and there's maybe a degree of peace in some of those areas. And the TNLA has done some really interesting things, like welcoming CDM doctors and nurses into former government hospitals that are now in Ta'ang controlled areas and treating them really well. I don't think that's a universal condition, and I've heard rumors that in places under TNLA governance, people who don't speak Ta'ang have been forced to use Ta'ang as the language of public communication, that schools run by, for example, the KIA have not been allowed to teach in Jingpo due to kind of nationalist goals of the TNLA. These are rumors, right? I don't have like evidence of this, but it's not straightforwardly a benefit for everyone in the area. Now, something that's happening now that's worth mentioning is the MNDAA, the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army, is a close ally of the TNLA. And that Operation 1027 that TNLA was, co-running, they ran with the MNDAA, who are very powerful. And the MNDAA have signed a ceasefire with the Sita. I'm not sure exactly what the status of it is now, if that's been maintained or if that's been broken. But I think there's some, right now, what's going to happen in northern Shan State is still kind of an open question, even with the TNLA's solid gains. And I think that that's pretty scary for a lot of people. That answer is kind of all over the place. Forgive me. It's an evolving situation.
Thank you, Mike. So before we finish up, I think you've given us a really great overview of your thesis. And at the beginning, you talked about your plans and then what you ended up doing. So I think maybe you've still got some unfinished business with the Ta'ang. And of course, things are changing there rapidly. So you're about to embark on taking up a new position in Singapore. National University of Singapore. What can we expect from you there and in the future? Are you finished with the Ta'ang? Are you going to move on to other topics of interest, or are you going to drill down and really get to the bottom of things?
Well, I don't know that I can ever get to the bottom of things, but as long as, yeah, I mean, I am definitely not done learning about the Tang, and the more I learn, it feels like the less I know in some ways. So hopefully, I'm going to continue working with Tang communities in Myanmar and especially in northern Thailand going forward. And I guess one of the questions that I'm most interested in right now is how Taang migrants in Thailand are making a new kind of world for themselves there, and how they are participating in the Thai economy, in Thai political life in ways that were unimaginable to them under the conditions that they'd lived in Myanmar, for better and for worse. So I'm going to keep working on that. I'm interested in the way that digital communication tools have allowed new forms of reconnection between Myanmar and between the Ta'ang community of Myanmar and the Ta'ang community of Thailand. And on this kind of like technological note, I'm also interested in the way that people are using really tools like Facebook Marketplace to change the way that agricultural products are traded. And this, I guess, stems from my interest in Bweza and brokers. Bweza still loom large in Myanmar for sure. But what I found on the Thai side of the border is that a lot of Ta'ang people were kind of making these peer-to-peer markets that changed the way the Buesa system worked, the broker system worked, to where they wouldn't be kind of going to a centralized marketplace, but farmers would run a kind of Facebook marketplace account or these kind of local market like Facebook in Thailand has these pages that work kind of like a centralized, localized market message board for a given district. And I found a lot of Taong farmers totally going around agricultural brokers, not engaging in contract farming, and selling directly to consumers through these centralized marketplaces. So I'm going to be looking at that as well, and that's part of one of my next projects.
Oh, that's awesome, Mike. I look forward to that. And of course, it's always great anyone paying close attention to Facebook and Meta and its ongoing ambivalent impact on the world. Okay. That's awesome. Now, before we finish up again, I always ask for recommendation. So I don't know if you brought anything related to Myanmar that you'd like to recommend to our listeners before we close.
So, yeah, I've got a few recommendations. There are going to be a lot of books coming out, some that are already out that are worth reading, and one article that I would push to the listeners, I guess. So maybe I'll start with the article because it's like more digestible than a book, but there's an article that came out in EndNotes, the kind of leftist cultural and politics journal based in the UK. It's called Unhappy is the Land That Needs Heroes by Jeff Aung. And I think for anyone who wants to get a kind of overview handle on politically and economically what has happened from the coup till now, how do we interpret it? What does it mean? I would go there first. Unhappy is the Land that Needs Heroes. That would be sort of my first recommendation. If you haven't come across it yet, check it out. Then next, two recent books. One, Justine Chambers's Pursuing Morality, which is a deep dive into Pa'an, the kind of politics of the everyday in the Karen world. And that is important, I think, because the Karen people as a whole and the many armed groups that exist throughout the Karen world, including those affiliated with the KNU and many others, they are kind of at the vanguard of setting the tone for what happens in the revolution as a whole. So I think reading Justine's book will help you understand kind of the Karen world in this way that could be very helpful. Another one that I would recommend is Elliot Pressey Freeman's recent Rights Refused. That's one I'm reading right now. That's helped me a lot for understanding the kind of nuances of resistance movements and leftism in Myanmar as a whole. And I guess I'll stop there. That's probably enough of a list for people to get into.
Yeah, 3 great recommendations, Mike. I'm happy to say I've read them all. Okay.
Fantastic.
It's awesome. So great to have you on Myanmar Musings. Maybe your last appearance from the Australian National University, and wishing you all the best when you relocate to Singapore.
Thank you so much, Luke. Thanks for having me.